"You're coming with me," said the cowboy softly, after finding her on the cold ground, her body. The sky was beginning to darken, a pale orange light casting long shadows across the vast wilderness. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the chill of the coming night. In the distance, the silhouette of a lone figure moved slowly across the rough, barren terrain. It was Jack Miller, a cowboy who had spent most of his life roaming the open plains, always searching for something, though he didn't always know what.
He was used to solitude, and the silence of the land never bothered him.
His horse, Rusty, plodded along beside him as Jack guided it across the rocky ground. He'd been out riding for hours, checking the perimeter of the area for signs of any trouble. It had been a quiet day, too quiet, in fact. Jack had learned long ago that when the land was quiet, you needed to be extra cautious. Trouble had a way of sneaking up on you when you least expected it. Jack wasn't in any hurry, but he kept his eyes sharp, scanning the horizon. The sun had almost disappeared completely when he spotted something unusual on the ground. At first, he thought it was just a pile of rocks or some discarded brush, but then he saw it move, a faint, weak twitch of a hand. His heart skipped a beat. Without thinking, Jack pulled the reins to the side and urged Rusty forward, trotting quickly toward the spot. As he drew closer, he saw the shape of a person lying on the cold earth. His breath caught in his throat. It was a woman. Her body was sprawled awkwardly on the ground, her limbs bent in unnatural ways. Her face was pale, her lips almost as white as the snow that was beginning to fall around them. Her clothes were torn and stained, and there were dark bruises around her neck, suggesting she had been through something violent. She looked as if she had been abandoned there, left to die alone. Jack dismounted quickly, his boots hitting the ground with a dull thud as he rushed over to her. He knelt down beside her, careful not to move her too much. Her breathing was shallow, and he could feel the cold seeping from her body. The first thing he did was check her pulse. Weak, but it was there. She was alive, but just barely. Her clothes were soaked with the cold, and her body trembled slightly with each breath she took. He cursed under his breath. "What in the world happened to you?" he muttered, glancing around. There was no sign of a campfire or any other people nearby, just the vast, empty wilderness. Jack had seen his fair share of hardship, both in the Wild West and in his own personal life. He had faced battles both physical and emotional, but never had he encountered a situation like this. Beth's, whoever had left her here had meant for her to die. Without hesitation, Jack pulled off his coat and draped it over her body, trying to shield her from the biting wind. She was shivering uncontrollably now, her body reacting to the cold and shock. Jack knew that if he didn't act fast, she wouldn't survive the night. He gently lifted her into his arms, cradling her close to his chest. She was light, too light, and as he carried her, he could feel her limp form against him. Jack's mind raced. He had to get her to shelter, and fast. He couldn't leave her here to freeze in the wilderness. Turning back toward Rusty, Jack moved quickly, carefully maneuvering the woman into a position that would allow him to ride. It wasn't easy, but he had done this kind of thing before, moving quickly to save someone, even when it seemed hopeless. Once the woman was settled in front of him, Jack urged Rusty forward, making the horse move as fast as it could manage. Breath. Every step felt like a race against time. The cold was closing in, and the woman's condition was worsening with each minute that passed. As the miles stretched on, Jack kept his eyes forward, barely glancing at the unconscious woman in his arms. He couldn't afford to think about the fact that she might die before they reached his cabin. He had to focus, had to keep moving. The wind whipped through his hair, but he barely felt it. His thoughts were consumed with one thing: survival. He had seen enough people die in his life to know that time was critical. minutes turned to hours, and the darkness of the night pressed down on them, making everything feel heavier. Jack pushed Rusty onward, his mind wandering to thoughts of the past. He had learned long ago to expect the unexpected out here.
In the wilderness, there was no room for softness. You couldn't afford to show weakness.
Yet, as he held the woman, something stirred inside him, a sense of protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. Rusty slowed to a walk, his hooves crunching in the snow. They were getting closer to the cabin now. Jack could see the small glow of the lantern inside from a distance. His heart raced with a mix of relief and dread. He had to get the woman inside, get her warm, and keep her alive long enough to find out what had happened. But the truth was, Jack didn't know what kind of story he was about to uncover. He didn't know who she was, or why she had been left to die out here. But he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't just leave her there. When they finally reached the cabin, Jack dismounted and carefully lifted her down. His hands were cold, his body sore from the long ride. But his concern for her kept him moving. He kicked open the door and hurried inside, where the warmth from the fireplace greeted them like an old friend. Placed her gently on the wooden floor, his heart in his throat as he noticed how pale she had become. Jack went straight to work, stoking the fire and gathering blankets. He stripped away her wet clothes, moving quickly to get her warm. She was unconscious, but her body still twitched with the occasional spasm. He knew the cold could be just as deadly as any bullet, and he wasn't about to let it claim her. He worked quickly, wrapping her in blankets and trying to coax warmth back into her body. The fire crackled in the corner, its light flickering across the small room. Jack paced, waiting. Time seemed to drag on, every second feeling like an eternity. But finally, after what felt like hours, the woman began to stir. Her eyelids fluttered, and Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Fast. She was alive. Her eyes opened slowly, blinking in confusion as they adjusted to the light. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, but there was no fear, just a quiet, confused uncertainty. Virus. Jack leaned forward, his voice soft. "You're safe now. You're with me." His words were simple, but they held a truth she could feel. The woman didn't speak at first. She just stared at him, as if trying to understand where she was and who he was. Jack sat back, giving her the space she needed. She wasn't ready to talk. And Jack wasn't about to push her. He had learned the hard way that people who had been through something traumatic needed time to process. For now, all Jack could do was wait and hope that this stranger who had appeared in his life so suddenly would be able to find her way through whatever storm had brought her to him. The fire crackled softly in the corner of the cabin, its warmth spreading across the room. His boots resting on the worn wooden floor, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the woman still resting on the bed. She had fallen into a deep sleep after the long hours of being carried across the harsh terrain, and Jack knew she needed time to recover. But as he sat there, alone with his thoughts, his mind kept returning to the same question. Who was she? And how had she ended up out there, alone and in such a condition? Jack had spent a lot of time on his own, and he had learned not to pry into others' business unless they were willing to share. He wasn't the type to ask questions. But this woman, she was different. Her appearance had been a sign of something much darker, and he knew deep down that her past had caught up with her in a way he couldn't understand yet. She was a survivor, but there was a story buried deep in her eyes, a story Jack was determined to uncover in time. For now, though, there was little Jack could do but wait. The snow had started falling heavily outside, the ground turning white and cold again. The wind howled against the cabin, but inside the warmth from the fire kept everything feeling secure. Jack made sure to keep the fire going, adding logs when needed, but other than that, he let the woman rest. He had no intention of disturbing her. She needed peace, and Jack was willing to give her that for as long as she required. Hours passed in quiet stillness. Jack had gone out to check on the horses, ensuring they were sheltered from the storm. As he stepped outside into the cold, the biting wind immediately stung his face, and he could feel the weight of the snowflakes falling softly onto his shoulders. It was a lonely night, and the only sound was the creaking of the trees swaying in the wind. But Jack was used to this kind of isolation. It was a part of his life, a part he had accepted long ago.
He had no need for much company, and he had learned to find peace in solitude.
But tonight, something about the woman inside his cabin made him feel a sense of responsibility he hadn't experienced in years. He returned to the cabin after checking the horses, the door creaking as he entered. The warmth inside felt like a blessing against the cold. The woman was still asleep, her breathing steady and calm, though she occasionally shifted restlessly beneath the blankets. Jack took a seat by the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. The world beyond the cabin was vast and empty, but inside it felt strangely alive with the presence of the woman he had rescued. As the night stretched on, Jack found himself thinking about the many times he had been in similar situations, alone, out on the open range, always looking for something that seemed just out of reach. He had been a wanderer for as long as he could remember, never staying in one place for too long. But something about the woman's quiet strength stirred something within him. He hadn't expected to be a caretaker or a protector. That wasn't his role in life. But now, as the fire burned low and the snow continued to fall outside, Jack realized that his life had just become more complicated. The storm outside intensified, the wind howling louder, rattling the windows. Jack glanced at the woman again. She seemed so small and fragile in the large bed, her dark hair tangled and matted against the pillow. He hadn't seen her face clearly at first, but now, under the warm light of the fire, her features were more distinct. She was beautiful in a way that made Jack feel a strange mix of sympathy and admiration. Rasp, having survived whatever ordeal had brought her to this point.
Yet there was something in the way she held herself, almost as if she was afraid to trust anyone, even in the safety of the cabin.
Jack wasn't sure how long she would stay. She hadn't spoken much, and the few words she had muttered when she first woke up were faint, almost inaudible. She had looked at him with a strange mix of gratitude and uncertainty, as if she wasn't sure whether to trust the man who had saved her life. Jack understood that trust was earned, not given freely. And it would take time for her to open up, if she ever did. But Jack wasn't the kind of man who pushed people to share their secrets. He was content to let her find her own way, but he also knew that she couldn't stay in this cabin forever. The outside world was vast and full of dangers, and Jack wasn't sure if she was prepared to face them on her own. He couldn't protect her forever. But for now, he could offer her shelter. He could give her the time she needed to recover, and that was all he could do. The following morning, the storm outside showed no signs of stopping. The snow had piled up, covering the ground in a thick white blanket. Jack stepped outside early to assess the situation, making sure the cabin and the horses were secure. When he returned, he found the woman awake, her eyes open and looking around the room with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. Jack nodded toward the fireplace. "You're awake," he said quietly, trying to break the silence. He didn't want to overwhelm her with questions. He wasn't in any hurry to get her talking, but he wanted her to know that she wasn't alone anymore. That was the most important thing. She was safe here for as long as she needed. She nodded faintly, her voice soft. "Thank you," she said, her words slow as if she were testing them out. She still seemed unsure, and Jack could see that she wasn't fully ready to speak about whatever had happened to her. But that was fine. Jack didn't expect her to share everything right away. "Rest as long as you need," Jack said, his voice gentle but firm. There's no rush. For the rest of the day, Jack kept to his usual routine. He cooked a simple meal over the fire, checking in with the woman occasionally to make sure she was comfortable. She hadn't said much more, but her eyes followed him as he moved around the cabin, and Jack could see the wheels turning in her mind. Right. She wasn't just recovering from the cold. She was recovering from something far more serious, something that Jack could only guess at. The days passed slowly, each one blending into the next. The storm outside seemed endless, but inside, the cabin remained a small, warm refuge. Jack kept busy, taking care of his chores and keeping the fire going, but he never left the woman's side for too long. He had learned to be patient, and he could see that she needed time. She didn't trust easily, and Jack understood that. He had been in her shoes before, feeling the weight of past pain and struggle, and knowing that trusting someone could be the hardest thing in the world. As the days went by, the woman seemed to regain some of her strength. Her face began to lose its pallor, and the shivers that had once racked her body started to fade. Still, she remained quiet, her eyes always watchful, always searching. Jack didn't push her to talk. He didn't have to. He knew she would when she was ready. Breaths. The silence between them was comfortable, even though neither of them spoke much. Jack could feel a change in the air, a subtle shift in the way she looked at him. It wasn't gratitude anymore. It was something deeper. She was beginning to trust him, little by little, and Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He wasn't used to being someone's protector, but somehow with this woman, it felt natural. The days had been passing quietly since Jack had found her on the cold ground. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a stillness that seemed to hang in the air. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold still clung to the world outside, a constant reminder of the harshness of the land. Inside the cabin, however, things had started to feel a little different. The warmth from the fire had become more than just physical comfort. It was the warmth of safety, of refuge. Jack had grown used to the quiet company of the woman who had come into his life so suddenly, and though she still said little, he could sense the change in her. She wasn't as distant as she had been in the beginning. There was something about her now, a subtle shift, like a door that was just beginning to open. For days she had stayed in the cabin, recovering from the ordeal Jack had rescued her from. Her name, she had finally told him, was Evelyn. Variety. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She didn't speak of her past, not yet. Jack hadn't asked. He wasn't the type to press someone for details they weren't ready to share. He had learned over the years that some wounds were too deep to be spoken of easily. But one thing was certain. Evelyn had been through something terrible. The bruises on her skin had faded, but the look in her eyes told Jack that the scars inside her ran much deeper. She was haunted by something. And Jack knew that no matter how much care he gave her, he couldn't fix whatever it was that had broken her. As the days turned into a week, Evelyn's condition improved. She was no longer as weak as she had been when Jack first found her. She could sit up now, and she ate the meals Jack prepared for her, though her appetite was small. There were moments when Jack would catch her looking out the window, her gaze distant, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. It was during these quiet moments that Jack began to notice something about her. The way she seemed to carry herself, even when she wasn't speaking. It was a careful, measured way of moving, as if she was constantly aware of her surroundings, as if she was always waiting for something to happen. Jack couldn't quite place it, But there was a sense of unease in the way she held herself. It wasn't just the physical weakness that still lingered in her body. It was a guardedness, a caution that was built into her very being. She was like a bird with a broken wing, but the moment it felt safe, it still didn't quite trust the cage. Jack couldn't help but wonder what had happened to her, what had pushed her to the point of nearly freezing to death out in the wilderness. Who had done this to her? But as much as Jack wanted to know, he also knew that Evelyn wasn't ready to share her story. She wasn't ready to open up, and he wasn't going to force her to. For now, he could only offer her what he could: his company, his cabin, and a place where she could heal. One evening after a quiet meal, Evelyn sat by the fire, her eyes fixed on the flames. Jack had grown accustomed to her silence, but tonight, something felt different. There was an air of expectancy, as if she were preparing herself to say something. Jack could feel it too, the tension in the room. It was like the calm before a storm, the moment when something would finally break.
"You're quiet tonight?" Jack said gently, sitting across from her.
His voice was soft, respectful of the space she needed. He wasn't trying to push her to speak. He was merely acknowledging the silence that had been hanging between them. Evelyn glanced up at him, her eyes meeting his for a moment before quickly looking away. There was a flicker of hesitation in her expression, a momentary pause before she spoke. "I didn't want to be here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack didn't speak right away. He simply waited, giving her the time she needed to find the words. He wasn't sure where she was going with this, but he wasn't going to interrupt her. "I thought I could make it on my own," she continued, her eyes still fixed on the fire. "I've been on my own for so long, I thought I could handle it, but I was wrong. I couldn't survive out there without help." Her voice trailed off, and Jack could hear the quiet regret in her words, the weight of something she hadn't yet fully come to terms with. Jack leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving her. He wasn't sure what to say, so he said nothing, letting the silence fill the space between them.
Evelyn seemed to need it, the quiet as much as the words.
She wasn't asking for anything, not really. She was just letting him in, just a little, sharing a piece of her truth.
"I'm not the person I used to be," she said after a long pause. "I don't know who I am anymore."
"I don't even know how to go back." The vulnerability in her voice hit Jack harder than he expected. It wasn't just the exhaustion that was in her words. It was the sense of loss, the deep ache of having lost something she couldn't get back. She wasn't just physically broken. Her spirit, too, had been wounded. Jack didn't respond right away. Desperate. He wasn't sure how to offer comfort to someone who had lost so much. All he could do was sit with her, share in the quiet, and let her know that she wasn't alone. That, at least, was something he could give her. He wasn't going to ask her to explain more than she was ready to. He wouldn't push. But he could listen. And that was what she needed most right now. As the fire crackled between them, Jack finally spoke. "You don't have to go anywhere just yet," he said softly. "Disk, you're safe here. You can stay as long as you need to." Evelyn didn't respond immediately. Break. Instead, she seemed to absorb his words, taking them in like a lifeline. Her shoulders, which had been tense, relaxed just slightly. Desperations from her eyes, once full of fear and caution, softened ever so slightly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She wasn't ready to trust completely, but Jack could see that she was starting to feel some measure of safety in his presence. In the days that followed, Evelyn began to open up more. She didn't speak of her past, but she began to trust Jack with little things. She helped him with chores around the cabin, moving slowly but steadily as she regained some of her strength. She wasn't the same woman who had been lying unconscious in his arms just a week ago. She was still fragile in many ways, but there was a spark in her that Jack hadn't seen before. She was a survivor, and though her journey had been a hard one, she was beginning to find the strength to stand tall once again. The bond between them grew over time, not in grand gestures but in quiet moments, like when Jack would offer her a cup of warm coffee in the morning, or when they would sit together by the fire in the evening, sharing stories of their lives, even if those stories were only fragments.
Evelyn had not yet shared everything with Jack, and Jack didn't expect her to. But they were finding a way to coexist in this small cabin, finding a way to heal, both physically and emotionally.
As the days turned into weeks, Jack couldn't help but feel that the woman he had rescued was becoming something more to him than just a stranger he had found on the cold ground. She was becoming a part of his life, a life that he had always lived alone. But now, the quiet seemed a little less lonely, and the cabin a little warmer. The days continued to pass, and with each new dawn the snow began to melt, revealing patches of brown earth beneath the once frozen ground. The cold grip of winter loosened its hold, and the world outside the cabin slowly started to wake up again. For Jack, it was a welcome change. The long days of solitude had started to feel less like a choice and more like a habit. Having Evelyn in the cabin had shifted something in his heart, a reminder that life wasn't meant to be lived alone. Inside the cabin, things had grown more comfortable as well. Evelyn had become more accustomed to her surroundings, and Jack had learned to respect the quiet that surrounded her. She was still distant in many ways, but he could see that she was starting to heal, bit by bit. She moved around more freely now, helping with chores, cooking a meal or two when Jack was busy with something else, and taking part in their simple routines. The silence between them was still heavy at times, but it was no longer the kind of silence that came with tension or uncertainty. It was the kind of quiet that only comes with shared understanding. One evening, as Jack was sitting near the fire sharpening his knife, Evelyn approached him. Her steps were soft, almost hesitant, as if she were unsure of how to break the silence. Jack looked up from his work, meeting her gaze, and for the first time in days he saw a flicker of something new in her eyes. It wasn't just the softness of someone recovering. It was something deeper. There was a quiet strength in her now, a steadiness that hadn't been there before.
"I've been thinking," Evelyn said, her voice gentle, but there was an edge of determination to it.
"I can't stay here forever. I know you're offering me safety, and I'm grateful for that. But I can't hide from my past forever." Jack put down his knife, his eyes never leaving hers. He hadn't expected this moment to come so soon, but he wasn't surprised.
He had sensed that she wasn't the kind of woman who could stay hidden for long, no matter how kind or welcoming the shelter was.
There was something about her, a restlessness, a drive to keep moving forward, to face whatever it was that had broken her in the first place.
"You don't have to rush," Jack said quietly.
His words were steady, but there was a softness to them, as if he were trying to offer her more time, more space.
"You've been through a lot, Evelyn."
Pay. No one expects you to have it all figured out in a day, or even a week. Evelyn's eyes softened at his words, but there was still a shadow of doubt in her gaze. She shook her head slowly, a faint sigh escaping her lips. "I know I'm not ready," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't just stay here forever. I need to face what happened. I can't keep running." Jack stood up slowly, his boots creaking against the wooden floor. He walked over to where she stood, his movements deliberate. He wasn't sure what to say, but there was one thing he knew for certain. Evelyn had been through something terrible, and whatever it was, it had left its mark on her. But he also knew that she couldn't stay here forever. She needed to find her own way, to heal in her own time. Jack could only offer her this cabin, this space, but he couldn't live her life for her. "You don't have to face everything all at once," Jack said, his voice firm but kind. "And if you need to leave, then I'll help you. You won't be alone." Evelyn's eyes met his, searching his face for sincerity, for the truth behind his words. She found it there, in the steady look he gave her, the same look he had given her since the day he found her on the cold ground. It wasn't pity, or even sympathy. It was understanding, and Evelyn knew that Jack meant what he said. He would help her if she asked, but the choice was hers to make. She nodded slowly, her gaze drifting toward the window where the last remnants of snow clung to the earth. It was clear she was torn, caught between the need to confront her past and the fear of what that would mean. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," Evelyn said quietly, almost to herself. "I've lost so much, and I don't know if I can find the strength to fight anymore." Jack walked over to the window and stood beside her, his gaze following hers out into the distance. Breath. "Strength isn't about never falling," he said, his voice low. "It's about getting back up every time. Even when you don't think you can." Bah. For a moment there was silence again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was the kind of silence that came with shared understanding, as if the words had already been spoken and there was nothing more to add. Evelyn turned her gaze toward Jack, meeting his eyes for the first time with a look that was full of both gratitude and uncertainty. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Jack nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You don't need to thank me. You're a survivor, Evelyn. Bye."
You'll find your way, and no matter what you choose, you'll always have a place here.
Over the next few days, Evelyn continued to recover, though her mind seemed far away at times.
She spent a lot of time by the window, staring out at the open landscape, as though waiting for something to change, something to tell her what to do next.
Jack respected her space, but he could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She was still unsure, still caught between the comfort of staying and the necessity of confronting her past. One morning after a quiet breakfast, Evelyn came to Jack, her eyes clearer than they had been in days. She seemed ready, as though a decision had finally been made in the quiet of her thoughts. She stood before him, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice was steady.
"I think I'm ready," she said, her words strong despite the uncertainty in her heart.
"I don't know what the future holds, but I can't hide from it anymore. I need to face whatever's waiting for me out there. When you're ready, I'll help you pack, and if you need to leave, you won't be alone. Brace. I'll see you to where you need to go." Evelyn looked at him, a mixture of gratitude and something else in her eyes, something more complex, deeper than simple thanks. Jack had been a refuge for her, but now she was taking the next step. She was ready to find her own path again, and though Jack would miss her presence in the cabin, he knew that this was what she needed.
"I'll never forget what you've done for me," Evelyn said quietly, her voice filled with sincerity.
"You saved my life. You gave me a chance to start over."
Bration. Jack placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch warm and firm.
You gave yourself that chance, Evelyn.
You're the one who's going to make it through. And just like that, in the quiet of that small cabin, the bond between them grew stronger, not just because of the days they had spent together, but because of the trust they had built in each other.
Evelyn was ready to face the world again, and Jack knew that no matter where life took them, they would always share the memory of this quiet, healing time together.
The morning dawned clear and bright, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the trees and spilling into the cabin. Jack sat by the window, his gaze drifting over the land beyond. The world outside seemed endless, vast stretches of wilderness, untouched by time. The snow had mostly melted now, leaving patches of green and brown where the earth had been hidden under a thick blanket of white. It was a new beginning for the world, just as it was for Evelyn. Jack wasn't sure what would come next. Evelyn had made her decision. She was ready to leave. He had known it was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. He'd grown accustomed to her presence in the cabin. There had been a quiet comfort in having someone else there, someone to share the long days and quiet nights with. But now the time had come for her to move on. Breaths. Jack knew it was the right choice. She couldn't stay hidden forever, and the past wasn't something that could be outrun. But the thought of her leaving felt like a small ache in his chest, something he hadn't expected to feel so deeply. Evelyn had spent the last few days preparing herself, gathering her things, and silently weighing the decision that had been on her mind for weeks. Breaths. Jack had done his best to give her the space she needed, not asking too many questions, not pushing her to explain everything all at once. She had shared more than she ever had before, but there were still pieces of her story that Jack knew would remain locked away, at least for now.
Evelyn walked into the room that morning, her steps slow but purposeful.
She had packed her things, and there was a quiet determination in the way she moved. She had a small bag slung over her shoulder, and her eyes, though still carrying the weight of her past, held a glimmer of resolve.
"I'm ready," she said quietly, standing in the doorway, her voice steady but carrying the weight of everything that had led up to this moment.
Breath. Jack looked at her, his expression soft but serious. "I know you are," he said, his voice low. "But you don't have to do this alone. If you need help, you know I'll be there." Evelyn smiled faintly, a small but genuine smile. "I know, and I'm thankful for that. But I think it's time for me to walk my own path. I need to face what happened, and I need to do it on my own terms." Jack nodded, his heart heavy but understanding. He had known this moment was coming. He had seen the change in her over the past few weeks, the way she had started to stand taller, the way her eyes no longer carried the same weight of uncertainty. She had found the strength to face the world again, and Jack couldn't deny that he was proud of her for it.
"You've come a long way," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion.
"I'm proud of you, Evelyn." She looked at him, her eyes softening, and for a moment there was a silence between them. It was the kind of silence that held so much unspoken, a moment of mutual understanding and shared respect. Then she stepped forward, her small bag in hand, and she placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly. "For everything. For saving me. For giving me a place to heal, and for understanding when I couldn't explain." Jack met her gaze, his hand gently resting on hers.
"You didn't need to explain," he said. "You've already done more than enough just by being here." "You saved yourself, Evelyn. I just gave you a place to start over."
Animated in the sudden light, stood there locked in that quiet exchange, each of them knowing that things were about to change. The cabin, which had been their refuge for so long, would no longer be the same.
But neither of them knew what the future held, only that they had to let go of the past to move forward. Evelyn finally pulled her hand away, taking a deep breath as she turned toward the door. Jack watched her go, his heart heavy but his mind clear. He had done everything he could for her, and now it was time for her to take the next step. He wasn't sure where her journey would lead her, but he had a feeling that she was going to be all right. She had strength within her that she hadn't even fully realized yet. As Evelyn stepped outside into the bright morning light, Jack followed her to the door, watching as she stood there, taking in the wide expanse of the land. The wind rustled through the trees and the sun bathed everything in a warm golden glow. For a moment it felt like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for Evelyn's next move.
I don't know what's out there, Evelyn said, her voice almost to herself. But I have to find out. I have to know what's left for me. Jack stepped up beside her, looking out at the horizon. The world is a big place, he said softly.
But you're not alone anymore. Not in here. He tapped his chest. Not in here. Evelyn turned to look at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. Birth. I won't forget this. You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope. But I can't thank you enough for that.
You don't need to thank me,
Jack said with a small smile.
You've done the hard part. You've found the strength to start again.
That's more than most people ever do. Evelyn hesitated for a moment before stepping forward and giving Jack a quick, tight hug. It was brief, but in that simple act, everything they had shared in the past weeks seemed to come full circle. She didn't say anything, but Jack could feel the depth of her emotions, the weight of her gratitude. He returned the hug just for a moment before stepping back. I'll be all right, Evelyn said, a slight tremor in her voice, but her eyes were steady. I have to be. You will be, Jack replied. I have no doubt about that. With a final look, Evelyn turned and walked toward the small trail that led away from the cabin, the one that would take her into the unknown. Jack watched her for a moment, his heart heavy, but there was no regret in his chest, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had done what he could. He had given her the chance to heal, the space to recover, and now she was going to find her own way.
That was all anyone could ask for. As she walked away, Jack took a deep breath, watching her disappear into the distance.
He didn't know what the future held for her, but he knew one thing for sure. She would be okay.
And that thought brought a small, quiet sense of peace to his heart.
Evelyn was strong. She had already shown him that. And now she was ready to face the world. The wind stirred the trees. The earth seemed to stretch on forever, and the sun shone brightly on the land. Jack turned back to the cabin, knowing that life would continue, that time would move forward, but he also knew that what they had shared would never be forgotten. The cabin would always be here, and so would he, waiting for the next chapter of his own life to begin.